The party is over, and anyone still pretending otherwise is either politically invested in denial or professionally incapable of understanding the battlefield. When China quietly completed its successful test of a maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicle designed specifically to evade and defeat every existing American missile defense system in the Pacific, the strategic balance didn't just shift, it collapsed. I've spent my entire career analyzing force structures, doctrine, and technological thresholds. And I can tell you without hesitation, this single development marks the end of U.S. dominance in the Pacific, not because American troops lack courage, not because American engineers lack talent, but because our political and military leadership has spent decades lying to itself about the nature of modern warfare. This failure, like every major strategic failure in our history, is a failure of doctrine, not bravery, a failure of leadership, not resources. When I say the party is over, I mean the illusion that American missile defense could contain or deter a peer-level adversary is now permanently dead. China didn't simply demonstrate a hypersonic glide vehicle. They demonstrated maneuverability at hypersonic velocities, sustained atmospheric skipping, unpredictable trajectory patterns, and terminal phase evasion, precisely the capabilities required to neutralize the very systems Washington has spent hundreds of billions of dollars marketing as world-class. What Beijing just tested is a weapon built to exploit our strategic arrogance. It is not designed to hit a random target. It is designed to exploit Patriot, THAAD, Aegis, and every layered defense we have in the region. It is a weapon optimized to expose the truth we keep running from. America's deterrence posture in the Pacific is no longer credible. But you cannot understand the significance of this moment without understanding the core of the crisis: attrition math. Western politicians and Pentagon appointees still think wars are won with narratives, sanctions, and symbolic shows of force. They don't understand what every serious military historian knows. Wars are won by destroying the enemy's ability to resist. That means logistics, manpower, and sustainable firepower. It means accepting that modern battles are defined by the brutal arithmetic of industrial capacity and the slow degradation of units over time. But Washington treats attrition like an outdated concept from a dusty Cold War manual. They prefer slogans about lethality and readiness, meaningless words that avoid the hard truth that the U.S. military has not fought a peer adversary in 80 years, and the institutional muscle memory is gone. When I look at China's new hypersonic capability, I see a leadership class that understands attrition math perfectly. They're building systems that multiply the cost of American intervention, that deliver strategic paralysis, and that force Washington to consider casualty numbers and logistics it hasn't confronted since Korea. Meanwhile, the Pentagon continues to operate under the delusion that high-tech gadgetry and boutique procurement programs can compensate for doctrinal failure. The truth is brutally simple. You cannot out-narrative physics. You cannot legislate your way around Mach 10 glide vehicles. You cannot bluff when the other side has the ability to erase your forward bases before you can even reposition. Let me be blunt. The Chinese didn't just test a weapon. They set a trap. A strategic trap built on our own arrogance. Washington still believes it can deter China in the Taiwan Strait the same way it deterred weaker adversaries, not with overwhelming force, but with media messaging and political pressure. But China is building the capability to strike Andersen Air Force Base, Kadena, Yokosuka, and every key naval installation in the first and second island chains before a single U.S. carrier group can arrive in theater. That's not speculation, that's the operational reality. Beijing has spent the last 15 years constructing, while we were busy with counterinsurgency fantasies in the Middle East. We're facing a military establishment that refuses to admit it is outmatched in specific theaters because doing so would force accountability. Instead of confronting the hypersonic gap, they push out talking points about intercepting the threat spectrum and future kill webs, meaningless jargon that conceals the simple fact that nothing America has can intercept a maneuverable HGV moving at hypersonic speed. That's not defeatism, that's physics. China understands that modern warfare isn't about public relations exercises. It's about range, speed, mass production, and the ability to outlast and overwhelm. The U.S. military has been structured for decades around the opposite assumption: quick wars, light losses, and guaranteed dominance. This is not dominance, this is exposure. The most dangerous part is that America's political leadership still pretends the Pacific is a contest of willpower. They believe China's new weapon is just another challenge to be met with stern statements and budget increases. But this isn't about political will. This is about mathematics. It takes China months to build missile systems we take years to replace. It takes China days to mobilize manpower we cannot recruit in years. The U is facing a strategic environment where attrition math is no longer in our favor, and our leadership refuses to acknowledge it. We're not simply behind, we're structurally incapable of catching up under the current doctrine. Our procurement cycles are bloated, our decision making is political, and our force structure is designed for wars that no longer exist. China's hypersonic test didn't create this vulnerability, it exposed it. It revealed that everything Washington has promised its allies about security in the Pacific is based on outdated assumptions and untested systems. When your missile defense is useless against the adversary's primary strike weapon, your entire deterrence architecture collapses. This is the operational trap Beijing has set. They know we cannot admit weakness without losing political credibility. They know our allies rely on American assurances more than American capabilities. And they know that Washington's political class is too invested in its own mythology to confront the truth. China is maneuvering the United States into a position where any intervention becomes a losing proposition before the first shot is fired. That is not speculation. That is the conclusion of every serious analysis of hypersonic warfare in a contested theater. And the tragedy is that none of this had to happen. If Washington had invested in realistic doctrine instead of political theater, if Pentagon leadership had prioritized firepower and survivability over diversity training and bureaucratic promotions, if Congress had demanded competence instead of campaign contributions from defense contractors, we wouldn't be discussing an American deterrence collapse in the Pacific. But here we are. China tested a hypersonic glide vehicle. What they really tested was the hollow core of American strategic planning, and they found it empty. The West keeps clinging to a fantasy, this belief that maneuver warfare, rapid thrusts, and precision-guided chaos can still dominate a battle space utterly transformed by drones, hypersonic glide vehicles, and layered sensor grids. This fantasy is rooted in a doctrinal mindset developed in the 1,980 seconds, refined in the 1,990 seconds, and mythologized after Desert Storm. But wars fought against dysfunctional Middle Eastern armies, insurgents with no air forces, and militias without electronic warfare capabilities created an illusion that American maneuver doctrine was universally superior. It isn't. In fact, in a peer-level fight, Western maneuver doctrine collapses almost instantly. Look at the battlefield today. Drone saturation has made movement dangerous. Artillery, not maneuver brigades, dictates the tempo of real combat. Precision fires dominate, and battlefield visibility approaches total transparency. Armored thrusts, the centerpiece of Western doctrine, are no longer decisive when every vehicle can be tracked, targeted, and destroyed at standoff distance. The Chinese understand this perfectly. They've integrated long-range precision strike complexes into their overall doctrine while the West still clings to maneuver mythology. That's the difference between a doctrinally adaptive military and one stuck in its own propaganda. I've spent decades warning that the West's obsession with maneuver warfare was unsustainable in a world where drones, hypersonics, and cheap, mass-produced munitions define lethality. But the people making decisions in Washington and Brussels have never fought an industrial war. Most have never worn a uniform. They come from law schools, political science departments, consulting firms, and think tanks funded by defense contractors. They speak in abstractions, multi-domain operations, decision superiority, future conflict ecosystems, because they lack the technical literacy to speak in realities. The result is doctrinal blindness. China, meanwhile, has revived a strategic approach rooted in historical realism. They understand that modern warfare is much closer to World War I's industrial attrition and World War II's firepower-centric battles than to the lightning war fantasies Western planners love to recycle. The Chinese don't waste resources on romantic ideas about decisive armored breakthroughs or force-on-force maneuver battles. They rely on mass fires, long-range strike capabilities, deep sensing networks, and overwhelming industrial output. They're building a military for the war that actually exists, not the war Western institutions imagine. This doctrinal divergence mirrors the catastrophic difference between Russia and NATO in Ukraine. The West pushed maneuver warfare, Russia pushed attrition warfare. The result was predictable to anyone who has studied military history. The side using industrial firepower always wins, against the side relying on maneuvers unsupported by overwhelming fires. But Western leaders were too arrogant, too ideological, and too ignorant to understand this. Instead of learning, they doubled down on failure. They treated Russia as if it were Iraq with snow. They treated China as if it were a scaled-up version of Iran. They treated hypersonics as a future challenge instead of a present threat. This is not an intelligence failure. It's a leadership failure. You cannot expect meaningful doctrine from people whose expertise comes from academic theorizing instead of battlefield experience. The U.S. and NATO militaries are run by individuals who write PowerPoints, not war plans. They think in career timelines, not strategic timelines. They care about political optics, not operational survivability. That's how you end up with generals who talk endlessly about values, alliance, unity, and shared democratic principles, while ignoring that the Chinese military is building kill chains designed to saturate, blind, and obliterate American forces before they can even maneuver. Every major technological shift in warfare has demanded doctrinal change. The machine gun forced armies to abandon the bayonet charge. Tanks forced an evolution beyond static trench warfare. Air power demanded new thinking about mobility and supply lines. But hypersonics, drones, and precision-guided mass fires represent the next doctrinal revolution, and the West is refusing to adapt. The Chinese aren't refusing. They've been preparing for this shift for over a decade. They've built the world's largest drone manufacturing base. They've mastered hypersonic flight. They've created the world's most dense, long-range missile ecosystem. Their military doctrine prioritizes firepower first, maneuver second. Their entire strategy in the Pacific is built around denying American forces any opportunity to maneuver. If you can't maneuver, you can't fight. And if you can't fight, you can't deter. This is why China's Hypersonic Glide Vehicle test is so devastating doctrinally. It confirms that the West is operating on outdated assumptions, while Beijing is operating on hard physics and historical precedent. Hypersonics don't just bypass missile defenses. They bypass the entire Western concept of victory. You cannot rely on maneuver warfare in a world where your forces can be annihilated from thousands of miles away before they ever enter the battle space. I've said this repeatedly. Wars are not won by who moves fastest. They're won by who can apply the most firepower for the longest period of time. That's attrition math. China understands it. Russia understands it. The West refuses to accept it. And this refusal is the most dangerous doctrinal failure since Vietnam. The lesson of every major conflict, from Verdun to Kursk to the Yom Kippur War, is simple. The side that insists on maneuver without overwhelming firepower suffers catastrophic losses. Yet the Pentagon still behaves as if drones and hypersonics are inconveniences, not paradigm shifts. They cling to maneuver doctrine because they don't have a replacement and because admitting failure would end careers. China just demonstrated that it is building for the future while America is still living in the past. Beijing's hypersonic test wasn't a surprise. It was the logical outcome of a doctrine built on realism, industrial capacity, and strategic clarity. It wasn't a technological stunt. It was a doctrinal declaration. And the declaration is unmistakable. China intends to dominate the battle space by mastering firepower at scale and denying the United States any opportunity to maneuver. This isn't a theory. This is the battlefield reality our leaders refuse to acknowledge. And until they do, every new Chinese test, every new missile, every new drone swarm will push the West deeper into strategic irrelevance. The deeper you dig into the Western military structure, the more obvious it becomes that the crisis we face today is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of an institution that rewards political loyalty over competence, compliance over courage, and bureaucracy over battlefield truth. China's hypersonic breakthrough did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because the United States has spent the last 30 years constructing the most self-delusional military bureaucracy in the modern world. An institution that believes PowerPoint presentations are strategy, spreadsheets are doctrine, and procurement cycles are more important than warfighting. Let me be painfully direct. The Pentagon is no longer a military headquarters. It is a political court, bloated, risk-averse, and corrupted by private industry. A structure designed not to win wars, but to justify budgets. The military-industrial complex, the same beast Eisenhower warned us about, no longer hides its influence. It openly dictates priorities, shapes doctrine, and suppresses any dissenting voice that threatens profit margins. It doesn't matter if a system works, it only matters if it sells. This is why the West is technologically stagnant. The Patriot missile system remains the poster child of this decay. A system that has failed repeatedly against low-cost drones, failed against ballistic attacks, and now stands utterly irrelevant against maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicles. Yet Western leaders still parade Patriot batteries around as if they're holy relics of an age that no longer exists. Patriot isn't a shield, it's a museum piece. A billion-dollar symbol of a military establishment that confuses marketing success with battlefield success. Meanwhile, China and Russia don't operate under these illusions. They build systems to work, not to sell. Russia's entire hypersonic portfolio, Avangard, Kinzhal, Zircon, exists because their military establishment is forced to confront reality directly. When the United States withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, Washington assumed it could construct a missile shield and maintain nuclear dominance indefinitely. Moscow immediately understood what that meant. The era of strategic stability was over. If Russia didn't innovate, it would be strategically suffocated. So they innovated. They developed hypersonic glide vehicles that rendered American missile defenses obsolete before they were even fully deployed. They designed nuclear-powered cruise missiles, like bureaucracy, capable of unlimited range. They developed Poseidon, an autonomous undersea nuclear delivery system no existing Western defense structure can detect, let alone stop. These systems were not created for prestige. They were created because Moscow had no choice. It was either technological innovation or strategic extinction. China watched all of this, and they learned. They saw how the United States abused its military-industrial complex to justify endless foreign adventures. They saw how the Pentagon refused to evolve. They saw how NATO clung to outdated systems, outdated thinking, and outdated leaders. And while Washington wasted trillions on counterinsurgency fantasies, Beijing methodically built a military designed to exploit every Western weakness. Institutional corruption kills innovation. You cannot develop new doctrine when your generals are promoted for agreeing with politicians. You cannot create new weapon systems when the companies that build them care only about revenue. You cannot prepare for peer warfare when your entire military culture is built around avoiding accountability. China does not suffer from these structural flaws. Russia, for all its problems, does not suffer from them either. They build weapons to fight wars. The United States builds weapons to enrich contractors. The difference is fatal. Look at the Western tank crisis. The United States, Germany, and Britain cannot produce heavy armor at scale anymore. The entire industrial ecosystem has been dismantled, outsourced, or hollowed out. The West can't replace tanks lost in training accidents, let alone a major war. Meanwhile, Russia has reopened Soviet-era production lines and is mass-producing armor faster than NATO can donate it. The West's answer? Press releases. Announcements of future capability expansions that will arrive in 2035, long after any war would be decided. China, by contrast, builds new missile brigades faster than NATO can form committees. They field new drone models every 6 months. They deploy new naval vessels at a rate the U.S. shipbuilding industry cannot even comprehend. And now, with their Hypersonic Glide Vehicle test, they have demonstrated not just technological parity, but technological superiority in the most strategically decisive domain of modern warfare. Hypersonics aren't just fast. They are structurally destabilizing. They compress decision-making time. They overwhelm sensors. They invalidate missile defense systems that cost billions and took decades to build. They turn fixed installations, air bases, ports, command centers into liabilities. You cannot fight a war when every critical structure can be destroyed in minutes with no opportunity for interception. China understands this. The Pentagon pretends not to. The tragic part is that the West still insists on treating technology as a public relations exercise. Every time the Pentagon is confronted with its own failures, it announces a new next-generation program, a new missile, a new fighter, a new drone. But the timelines are always the same: 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Programs bloated by middle management, risk assessments, congressional lobbying, and contractor delays. By the time these systems arrive, the battlefield has already evolved. The enemy has already adapted. The war has already been lost. This is not a technological gap. It is an institutional gap, one China and Russia no longer suffer from. Beijing doesn't have to fight defense contractors to build hypersonic weapons. Moscow doesn't need congressional approval to field new nuclear systems. Their militaries may not be perfect, but they are structurally aligned toward victory. The U.S. military is structurally aligned toward budget justification. China's Hypersonic Glide Vehicle didn't expose a technological weakness. It exposed an institutional rot. It revealed a Western military culture so deeply compromised by political corruption and profit-driven thinking that it can no longer innovate, no longer produce at scale, and no longer adapt doctrinally to the realities of modern warfare. The Pentagon is not losing to China because China is brilliant. It is losing because the Pentagon is corrupt. It is losing because the West cannot abandon a procurement system designed to enrich corporations instead of protecting the nation. It is losing because military leaders no longer lead, they comply. And while Western institutions cling to delusions, Beijing builds weapons to win wars that the West is no longer capable of fighting. When you reach the nuclear threshold and hypersonics bring you there, faster than any previous generation of weapons, you must confront the core of global security, the reality that strategic stability has been dead for over 2 decades. Most Western politicians don't understand this because they don't even know the history. They don't know what the anti-ballistic missile treaty meant, why it mattered, or how its destruction triggered the most dangerous arms race since 1962. They think nuclear weapons are bargaining chips. They think treaties are symbolic gestures. They think deterrence is a press conference. That level of ignorance is lethal. The ABM treaty wasn't just a Cold War relic. It was the backbone of global nuclear stability. It ensured that neither the U.S. nor Russia would build systems capable of reliably intercepting strategic missiles. That limitation wasn't a weakness. It was the foundation of deterrence. If both sides were vulnerable, both sides were restrained. If neither side could block a nuclear strike, neither side would start one. The balance was simple. Mutual vulnerability produced mutual caution. But in 2002, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the ABM treaty under the delusional belief that missile defense could make America invulnerable. Washington didn't just abandon the treaty, it abandoned the logic behind it. U.S. policymakers convinced themselves that defensive technology would outpace offensive technology, that the Pentagon could build a shield strong enough to neutralize Russian missiles, It was the ultimate expression of American hubris, the idea that physics, geography, and history could be defeated by funding increases and contractor optimism. Moscow saw through the fantasy immediately. Russia understood what Washington refused to admit. No missile defense system on Earth can stop a diversified nuclear strike. And if the United States was actively trying to build such a shield, then Russia had to respond or accept permanent strategic inferiority. They had two choices: trust American promises or build weapons capable of bypassing any future missile defense system. They chose survival. This is what created the modern hypersonic era. Russia didn't pursue weapons like Avangard or Zircon to show off. They built them because the United States forced them to. Hypersonics were not the beginning of an arms race, they were the retaliation. The Pentagon's withdrawal from the ABM Treaty triggered a technological revolution that Washington still pretends was spontaneous. The truth is uncomfortable. American political arrogance pushed Russia into a corner, and Russia responded by leaping a generation ahead in strategic weaponry. And now China has entered the same arena. Beijing's Hypersonic Glide Vehicle test is not merely a military milestone, it is a direct response to the same American posture that pushed Russia into hyperspeed innovation. The Chinese leadership watched the United States attempt to encircle them with missile defenses in the Pacific, push NATO-style alliances into Asia, deploy Aegis ashore systems in Japan, expand THAAD networks, and discuss preemptive options in policy circles. Beijing responded rationally. They built weapons that render American missile defenses irrelevant. They built systems that ensure China cannot be coerced, threatened, or intimidated. This leads us to the most dangerous part of the current strategic environment: the nuclear ambiguity of American delivery systems, specifically the Tomahawk missile. Few Western leaders understand how close the world is to accidental escalation. The Tomahawk can carry nuclear or conventional warheads, and it cannot be distinguished in flight. You cannot look at a radar screen and say, this one is nuclear, that one isn't. They fly the same trajectory, same speed, same altitude. That is a catastrophic problem. Imagine a crisis. The United States fires a conventional Tomahawk strike against a target in the Pacific. China's sensors detect multiple low-flying cruise missiles heading toward critical infrastructure. Beijing has seconds, perhaps minutes, to decide whether the incoming weapons are nuclear. They cannot wait to find out. They must assume the worst. This is not theory. This is the logic of nuclear doctrine. When you cannot tell the difference between a nuclear and conventional strike, you treat every strike as nuclear. This is the red line nobody in Washington understands. The United States still behaves as if it can launch conventional cruise missile strikes anywhere, anytime, without triggering escalation. That was possible against Iraq, Serbia, and Libya. It is suicide against China or Russia. When your delivery systems are dual capable, you create a world where miscalculation is more dangerous than intention. The line between conventional and nuclear war collapses. This is why Russia developed Poseidon and bureaucracy. These systems aren't just new weapons, they are strategic equalizers. They are designed to bypass every missile defense the U.S. has built or is planning to build. They guarantee survivable retaliation. They ensure that even if Washington dreams of a decapitation strike, no American city is safe. This was Moscow's message after the ABM betrayal. You will never be able to stop us. China's hypersonic test carries the same message, and yet American leaders refuse to listen. They talk about integrated deterrence, new capability pathways, and future resilience portfolios, meaningless phrases that conceal their ignorance. Strategic reality doesn't care about talking points. It cares about physics, speed, trajectory, and reaction time. China now possesses a weapon that travels so fast, maneuvers so unpredictably, and descends so violently that no American sensor system can track it consistently. That means the U.S. cannot guarantee the survival of its Pacific bases, it cannot guarantee the safety of its carrier strike groups, it cannot guarantee that a regional conflict will remain regional, And because Tomahawks are nuclear ambiguous, it cannot guarantee that a conventional American strike won't trigger a nuclear Chinese counterstrike. This is the strategic disaster nobody in Washington wants to discuss. A system built on untested assumptions, political narratives, and contractor promises is now confronted with a world where China and Russia have weapons designed to bypass every Western defense. The United States did this to itself. It broke the ABM treaty. It militarized dual-capable systems. It weaponized ambiguity. And it ignored every warning from military realists who understood the consequences. Now, we live in a world where hypersonics, nuclear ambiguity, and institutional incompetence create the perfect storm for accidental escalation. And worst of all, the political leaders responsible for this mess don't even understand the danger. The political collapse always arrives last, but it always arrives. Military failure precedes political crisis, and strategic humiliation shatters the legitimacy of governments faster than any economic downturn or social unrest. China's hypersonic breakthrough is not merely a military event, it is a political earthquake waiting to erupt across the Western world. Because once it becomes undeniable that the United States cannot defend Taiwan, cannot secure the Pacific, and cannot guarantee the survival of its forward bases, every alliance built on American promises begins to fracture. Politicians who have built their careers on the illusion of U.S. supremacy will find themselves exposed, embarrassed, and increasingly unable to justify the financial and strategic commitments they have made. Europe will be the first to feel the shockwave. NATO has tied its entire identity to American protection. Its political class has convinced its populations that strategic dependence is a strength, not a vulnerability. But when that protection is revealed as unreliable, when U.S. missile defenses are exposed as obsolete, when American naval power is neutralized by Chinese systems, when military realities contradict decades of political assurances, European governments will face a crisis of legitimacy they are wholly unprepared for. You cannot maintain public trust when your foundational security assumptions collapse overnight. This is where the funding crisis begins. NATO's military budgets are already stretched thin, and their industrial capacity is practically non-existent. They cannot produce artillery shells at the rate required to sustain even a regional conflict. They cannot produce tanks, ships, or aircraft at scale. They cannot build energy independence or strategic autonomy. Their entire model depends on the United States, and the United States is no longer capable of fulfilling the role it claims to hold. When European leaders are forced to confront this reality, the political backlash will be immediate and severe. The same dynamic is coming for Washington. The American political establishment has spent decades feeding the public a fantasy of indefinite dominance, claiming that U.S. power is eternal, unquestionable, and immune to decline. But history does not reward denial. When strategic failure becomes obvious, the political system that ignored the warnings becomes the enemy of the public. Leaders who insisted on maintaining global commitments without the industrial base to support them will be held accountable. Politicians who trusted defense contractors over military realists will be discredited. A system built on illusion cannot survive exposure. And this is the turning point the West now faces. Accept reality or collapse under denial. Reality means acknowledging that China is now a military peer capable of neutralizing U.S. systems across the Pacific. It means accepting that missile defense is not a shield but a myth. It means admitting that hypersonic weapons have permanently altered the balance of power. It means rebuilding doctrine, restructuring the military, and dismantling the corrupt procurement system that has hollowed out Western capability. Reality demands sacrifice, reform, and courage qualities the current political class has shown no evidence of possessing. Denial, on the other hand, guarantees collapse. If Western leaders continue pretending that technological gaps don't exist, continue throwing money at failed systems, continue promoting officers for political reliability rather than strategic competence, continue imagining that alliances can substitute for firepower, then the decline becomes irreversible. You cannot defeat physics with speeches. You cannot deter hypersonics with hope. You cannot maintain a global empire with shrinking production lines and inexperienced political elites. The final lesson is brutally simple. Great powers do not fall because their enemies are strong. They fall because their leaders refuse to confront the truth. China understands the battlefield. Russia understands the battlefield. The United States no longer does. If the West wants to survive as a strategic force, it must reject the political class that led it into this crisis and rebuild a culture of competence, restraint, and honesty. The age of illusions is over. The age of consequences has begun. It is time to demand accountability, not from soldiers, not from engineers, but from the political and bureaucratic class that allowed this catastrophe to take shape. It is time to end the era of empty slogans and replace it with an era of hard reality. Because without accountability, there can be no recovery. Without competence, there can be no deterrence. And without truth, there can be no future.